From 1997 to 2002, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Global Issues in the Bureau of International Organizational Affairs for the State Department. Among other accomplishments in that capacity, and here I just picked one because it seemed to me the most impossible task, he successfully broke a 7-year deadlock on a new treaty banning the use of child soldiers and, stunningly, managed the successful effort to secure Senate ratification. Most recently, he was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor in the State Department, where he helped forge better cooperation with the EU on human rights. He is now an Africa specialist, or the Africa specialist, at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He holds degrees from Stanford University and the Foreign Service Institute. He is married with 3 children and lives in Arlington. As you can see, we have a very distinguished panel of guests, and we're very excited to hear from them. We'll begin today with Peter Galbraith giving us the keynote address, and then that will be followed by a period of question and answer, and then we'll move into some other events. So, Ambassador Galbraith.
Professor Hawkins, colleagues on the panel, and students and faculty here at Brigham Young University. I want to thank you for the opportunity to come out and speak with you, not only for the opportunity to come to this really stunningly beautiful place on such a nice weather, but also to meet with so many students, and I'm impressed, of course, by the interest that is reflected in the number of people that are here at a discussion on human rights. Having taught at the War College, I know that the formula is that before you give a lecture, you're supposed to have a joke and a sporting reference. Well, I'll skip the sporting reference as a. Oh, that's good. Because I was going to say is the, or maybe I'll combine the sporting reference and the joke, which is what you do if you're a Red Sox fan, by definition. Well, you know, the Red Sox have been sold. Talk about globalization to a Philippine group. They're going to be moved and renamed the Manila Folders. All right. Now let me segue from that into a discussion of genocide. My topic is the collision between human rights and realpolitik, with a particular focus on the case of Iraq. But actually, I'd like to begin by exploring the topic more broadly, and I will take as my departure what Ronald Reagan said in the 1980 campaign, which is that in his administration, fighting terrorism would replace human rights as the administration's priority. Now, the question is, what did he mean? And was he, in fact, prophetic? Well, of course, part of this was simply a very common phenomenon in American politics, not confined to Ronald Reagan by any means, which was a reaction to what the man he was trying to replace was doing. Jimmy Carter had elevated human rights as a priority, and Ronald Reagan was going to take a different position. But there was also something else behind it, which was more fundamentally a belief that that human rights was not something that was central to the national security interests of the United States, that it was basically something of a frilly extra, a luxury, that the United States could not afford if it conflicted with fundamental interests, or even worse, that was potentially counterproductive. So human rights might be a tool that would be used against otherwise reliable American allies like Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, Pinochet in Chile, the Shah of Iran, who in the Republican critique Carter had let fall, replaced by Khomeini, the South African apartheid regime. Admittedly, flawed regimes, but who were better than the alternatives. And this was established intellectually by Gene Kirkpatrick, who was one of the intellectual architects of Ronald Reagan's foreign policy, at least in his first term, and who in 1979 wrote an article in Commentary called Dictatorships and Double Standards that in essence argued that communist regimes were totalitarian regimes from which there was no escape. Once a totalitarian system was established, you couldn't get out of it. By contrast, authoritarian regimes like the regimes like the Marcos regime or the Pinochet regime or the Argentine junta were authoritarian. Yes, they engaged in human rights violations, but they were capable eventually of reform. Now, and therefore should be supported as compared to the alternative. There's a certain irony in this proposition because it established Jean Kirkpatrick and her allies as one of the few believers in communism. I would say along with the true Marxists in the Soviet Union and communist China, but probably by 1980 there were no true Marxist believers left in the Soviet Union, just a bunch of cynics. But there was a belief that the communist system was, in fact, an extremely powerful system. Nonetheless, Reagan did not go as far as, for example, Nixon and Kissinger, who not only, in some cases, did not support human rights, but actively undermined democratic regimes in favor of an authoritarian or dictatorial alternative on the grounds that that would better protect the security of the United States. Of course, the most notable example of this was the effort to remove Salvador Allende, the democratically elected president of Chile, who was, of course, a Marxist. The core issue is presented in these cases, but it's not just confined to the Reagan administration. Basically, it's presented to in every administration, is does the promotion of human rights and democracy conflict or sometimes conflict with other American goals, such as winning the Cold War, containing or fighting terrorism, containing the Iranians, whatever the goal is? And if so, should the United States retreat on its human rights objectives? In short, should realpolitik trump human rights? And let me repeat that this is something that all American administrations have wrestled with. Carter, whose policy Reagan was reacting against, famously on December 31st, 1978, went to Tehran and praised the Shah of Iran as representing an island of stability in a sea of turmoil, about 9 months before the Shah ignominiously left Iran. A year later, after the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan, Carter offered American assistance to Zia-ul-Haq, the general who had overthrown the democratically elected government of Pakistan in 1977, who had hanged in 1979 his predecessor, the democratically elected prime minister, who was engaged in public floggings and executions, and a truly unattractive figure. But nonetheless, at that time, there seemed to be the greater goal of helping Pakistan resist a possible Soviet invasion, the Soviets having first taken Afghanistan and possibly were now going to take Pakistan in search for a warm water port. And in fairness to Reagan, although this was his coming in position, he later evolved, and here credit actually goes to Elliott Abrams, who was his second Assistant Secretary for Human Rights and is now in the current administration, who made the case that human rights actually was a useful tool in winning the Cold War. It wasn't just an obstacle. Obviously, it was a tool to be used against the Soviet Union and the countries, its satellites in Eastern Europe. But in order to do that, you also had to promote human rights elsewhere, and the Reagan administration played a constructive role in the end in the transition in South America, which when Reagan came in was almost all run by military dictators, to democracy in that area. Although the truth is the Reagan administration opposed congressional efforts to impose sanctions on the South African apartheid regime, sanctions which actually carried over Reagan's veto, and opposed the effort to cut off Marcos and supported him up to the day he fell, practically. But there are real differences among how the American presidents have responded historically and how the choices that we face today. These issues remain. Pakistan, I talked about the Carter dilemma, but it remains today. Should we support General Pervez Musharraf because he's useful in the war on terrorism, even though he took power by a military coup and is keeping power by a totally bogus referendum? Should we be silent on the issue of what Russia is doing in Chechnya, because Putin is a key ally in the war on terrorism, and more importantly, or as important, he has been acquiescent on other issues like Iraq. Russia voted with us in the end and in fact brought around the French and the Germans. NATO enlargement, he's accepted the expansion of NATO onto the territory of the former Soviet Union itself. And indeed, you might not want to criticize him because you want the reforms to go forward in Russia itself. These are real dilemmas. But there's a further issue that I want to explore, which is how real a conflict is it? Are we right in saying that there is a conflict between human rights and other objectives, national security interests, economic interests? And do we see, and even worse, act on a conflict that is not, in fact, there? Is it possible that in many cases, and I have to say many cases, there's no absolute here one way or another, is it not possible that not only is the so-called realpolitik approach unnecessary, but counterproductive? And now I turn to the case of Iraq. In 1980, to back up, Iraq in 1968, the Ba'ath Party took over. Saddam Hussein became vice president and almost from the start was the power behind the throne. 1979, he became the president of Iraq. In his first event, he had a packed meeting of the ruling Ba'ath Party, and he proceeded to call out names of many people, some of whom have been his close supporters. It was wonderful. There's a videotape of all of this, or film, I guess. And he said, you've betrayed me, and they were taken out of the room and shot right then and there. That initial brutality was followed by a decision in 1980, September, to invade Iran, which started the 8-year Iran-Iraq War, which was a bloody World War I kind of trench warfare. 1983, he began to use mustard gas against the Iranians, the first major use of chemical weapons since the 1925 Geneva Protocol that banned the use of chemical weapons. In 1987, he launched the Anfal campaign against the Kurds, to which Professor Hawkins has alluded. This was a campaign aimed at the systematic destruction of the Kurds of Iraq, who constituted about 20 to 25% of the country's population. It involved the destruction of every village in Kurdistan in what had been a primarily rural region. I traveled through Kurdistan, I guess one of two Americans who did so, as this was taking place. And it was really stunning. We had maps and driving up to Suleimani in Kurdistan. On the one side of the road, there'd be rubble. On the other side, there'd be bulldozers and abandoned homes as they were actually in the process of destroying the villages. You could see people then being relocated to what were called victory cities, but were really, in fact, concentration camps. The destruction of villages was accompanied by mass executions, and the documents that the Kurds captured in 1991 and gave to me, brought out of Iraq in 92, record tens of thousands of executions. But very bureaucratic. Mass killers tend quite often to be real bureaucrats. So they record in the file, we captured 37 people, 16 children, 5 men, 10 women. Do we carry out paragraph 2 of Ba'ath Party Decree of 1987? And you'll see the cable back, yes, carry it out. And then you'll see 37 death certificates, and then you'll see, for example, receipts from some family members claiming the bodies, and a little charge for the bullets, which was characteristic. So you had the destruction of the villages. You had mass executions. You had deportation of population, not only to these victory cities, but also to the south, many of whom never came back. And you had, beginning in 1987, the systematic use of chemical weapons. Now, how did the United States respond to this? Well, 1983, Iraq began the use of chemical weapons against the Iranians. And in 1984, the United States upgraded its diplomatic relations with Iraq from intersection to full diplomatic relations. 1987 was the start of the Anfal campaign. 1987, the United States began sharing intelligence with Iraq to help it in the Iran-Iraq war. Beginning in the 80s, but in the 84, but greatly increasing in the late 80s, we began to provide credit guarantees, enabling Iraq to buy $600 million a year in agricultural credits and $200 million a year in manufactured goods from the United States. Incidentally, credits, these were guaranteed loans, if you will, to Iraq. Needless to say, they didn't pay them back, so this was actually a bill picked up by the taxpayers. Now, why did the U.S. do this? Well, the Reagan administration was concerned, rightly concerned. I'm not saying the policy is correct, but the concern was right, that Iran might win the Iran-Iraq war. Iran, of course, was viewed as very hostile to the United States, particularly under the Ayatollah Khomeini. Had humiliated the United States in the hostage crisis. And you had the vision of an Iran dominating not only the northern part of the Persian Gulf and having itself in control of major oil resources, but controlling the oil resources of Iraq. So above all, the Reagan administration didn't want Iran to lose the Iran-Iraq war. Having decided on that policy, then U.S. officials began to persuade themselves that other things were true about Saddam Hussein, that he was a potential moderate. Yes, he was a strong man, but he could be a stabilizing force. If he consolidated power, possibly he might make peace in the Middle East. And if you go back and you look at the things that are coming out of academics and American thinkers at the time, as well as the administration, you see traces of this. When in March of 1988, Iraq gassed the Kurds in the city of Halabja, which there's no doubt about who did it now. The word was put out maybe the Iranians had did it. 5,000 people died in basically a stroke from nerve gases. And then, finally, on August 20th, 1988, the Iran-Iraq war ended, August 20th. The 25th, Iraq launched major attacks against Kurdish villages along the entire border with Turkey and the Duhok Governorate. This would actually be in the western part of northern Iraq, far from the Iranian border. The Congress responded, the Senate, sponsored by Claiborne Pell, liberal Democrat from Rhode Island, Jesse Helms, conservative Republican from North Carolina, Al Gore, who's the senator from Tennessee, Robert Byrd, who is the majority leader, something called the Prevention of Genocide Act, which it would have imposed comprehensive sanctions on Iraq, cut off all those credit guarantees, prohibited the importation of oil from Iraq, required the U.S. to oppose loans to Iraq, unanimously passed the Senate in a day. Actually, something I've never seen. I worked for 14 years for the Senate. A major piece of legislation, go through that quickly. What was the response of the Reagan administration? it was premature. Now, premature, you could say, well, what point does it become mature to act? I mean, how many Kurds actually need to die before you can say that a response was appropriate? Why? Why did they take this position at the time after the Iran-Iraq war had ended? Well, I think they again had persuaded themselves that Iraq was a potential strategic partner, and that in spite of this record of Saddam launching an attack on Iran, the consistent abuses against other Iraqis, the attacks on the Kurds, that this was a regime that was capable of reform. What lesson did Saddam, and so eventually, although the Prevention of Genocide Act had passed the Senate, a weaker version passed the House, the Reagan administration was able to defeat it, and as a result, there was no substantive response to Iraq's use of chemical weapons against the Kurds or the Anfal campaign. Then you can ask, what lesson did Saddam Hussein draw from all of this? Did he see that the United States was a strategic partner? Well, it didn't quite turn out that way. What he did think was that he was so important strategically that basically he could do what he wanted. And I think this is why he thought he could get away with the invasion of Kuwait. Sure, he expected there would be rhetorical opposition. The U.S. had condemned the use of chemical weapons. But that when it came to concrete action, the United States would not take any action. Of course, he turned out to be wrong. And the United States did act under the leadership of the first President Bush, very effective building of an international coalition, a very brief war. And in the midst of the war, the first President Bush, on the 15th of February in Andover, Massachusetts, and then in Washington the same day, called for the Iraqi people and military to overthrow Saddam Hussein. However, at that time, the Bush administration was refusing to meet with the Iraqi opposition, including the Kurds who were coming to Washington. But though they did take this call seriously, the war ended on the 27th of February. On the 2nd of March, the uprising began, actually when Iraqi captain driving back through the southern city of Basra in retreat from Kuwait turned and aimed his tank at the large picture of Saddam Hussein in the main square in Basra. And it literally ignited an uprising that took over the entire south of Iraq, right up to the gates of Baghdad. A few days later, it began in Kurdistan, and basically all of the north of Iraq, at least the Kurdish north, was in rebel hands. What did the administration do? Nothing. In fact, worse than nothing. Schwarzkopf had said with a great deal of swagger, "You fly, you die." You know, the Iraqis couldn't fly. And then they were allowed to use helicopters, which were extremely effective in putting down the uprising, particularly against the Kurds, who associated helicopters with delivery of chemical weapons. Panic the civilians. You panic the civilians, the fighters also leave. And in the case of the South, actually Iraqi forces were allowed to pass right by American lines, because we were in southern Iraq, to put down the uprising with the Shiites. What were the consequences? Why? Why did they do it? Well, because they were afraid that the agenda of the Kurds was to break up Iraq, that they would want to create an independent Kurdistan, which is something the Kurds have long sought in Iraq. And they were afraid that the Shiites would be pro-Iranian because they were co-religionists to the Shiite branch of Islam, which is dominant in Iran, about 90%. The same branch is about 55-60% of the population in Iraq, but Iraq has always been governed by the other branch of Islam, the Sunni branch. So that if you had a rebellion of the Kurds and the Shiites, this would break up Iraq, and it would go against American strategic interests. So we did nothing. We allowed the uprising to be crushed. What were the consequences? Kurdish refugees fled into Turkey, where President Özal allowed CNN to come in and record what was going on. The pictures became so intolerable that there was a demand for action. The United States re-intervened. It created a safe haven for the Kurds to enable them to return home. In order to create that safe haven, it had to expel the Iraqi authorities. The Kurds filled the gap, and they created in northern Iraq a de facto independent Kurdish state that exists to this very day. And guess what? What chance do you think there is that these guys actually will agree to go back under control from Baghdad? None. A policy which basically went against American values, which allowed a people to be crushed in a rebellion that we called for, because of the strategic consideration of keeping Iraq together, had the result of de facto breaking Iraq apart. And there's no way that the Kurdistan is going to come under the control of Baghdad again. Worse in the south. Saddam put down the rebellion. There was no intervention there. About 300,000 Shiites died between March and September of 1991. How did they look at the U.S.? They looked at Bush, who had called for rebellion and then allowed it to be crushed. Now, they didn't think that this was a strategic consideration. From their point of view, they assumed it was intentional, that Bush actually wanted Saddam to kill the Shiites. And remember, look at how other people see the United States. They see the United States as a great power, that what happens must be what the U.S. intends. And believing it was intentional, one of the great surprises for the Pentagon is that when they came up through the south of Iraq, through the area of the Shiites, brutally suppressed by Saddam Hussein, they were not greeted with flowers and hugs and cheers. And why not? 1991. Incidentally, of course, Kurdistan was incredibly enthusiastic about the U.S. invasion of Iraq. So this last war, they were great allies. So again, did realpolitik, did ignoring fundamental human rights serve U.S. interests in Iraq? Was the United States better off by acquiescing in 1983 in Iraq's use of chemical weapons and its development of more sophisticated chemical weapons? In 83 it began with mustard gas, but in the 80s it developed various nerve agents. Did it serve U.S. interests to look the other way as Saddam gassed the Kurds, destroyed the villages, launched the Anfal campaign? Did the U.S. decision not to support the uprising serve to hold Iraq together, reduce Iranian influence, and make the Shiites more pro-American? Was the U.S. better off with Saddam remaining in power for another 12 years? And what is the cost of the current war? Not just economically, politically, but what about lost opportunities? Are we dealing with the much more serious threat of weapons of mass destruction from North Korea? Is North Korea basically now able to get away with it because the U.S. is tied down in Iraq? Huge opportunity costs. And that follows from a decision for realpolitik reasons to leave Saddam Hussein in power. The 1990s, and let me just run through this quickly. The 1990s, human rights evolves in a very interesting way. You have the end of the Cold War, and with it, a significant diminution of the idea of national sovereignty, a diminution of the idea that a state within its own borders is able to do whatever it wants to its own people. And this is embodied in two major interventions that the U.S. led in the 90s, but in coalition. And at least the first one under the authority of the United Nations, that is the interventions in Bosnia and in Kosovo. In Bosnia, there were 200,000 dead in the war that took place between 92 and 95. The capital was besieged for about 1,500 days. Artillery rained in on every day. Other cities besieged. In the worst case, the town of Srebrenica was overrun, even though it was a UN safe area, and the 7,000 men and boys were taken away and executed. Ultimately, and in my view much too late, the United States did intervene in conjunction with the Croatians with NATO airstrikes that changed the military balance in Bosnia, made possible the Dayton Peace Agreement. Now, the Dayton Peace Agreement was built around human rights. Above all, establishing certain norms that none of the sides argued against, even though they didn't actually intend to keep them. But when we presented it to them and said, here are a set of human rights obligations you have to allow freedom of movement, you have to allow refugees to return home, you have to allow people to recover their property, and you have to prosecute war criminals. Nobody objected, including the war criminals. How could they argue against it? And there is a role for norms in this whole process. But, of course, they didn't think we were serious. But we planned carefully. NATO had been planning for 3 years for the intervention. It came in 60,000 strong, not in favorable circumstances like Iraq, but where the old regime was gone, but in circumstances where the old regimes, where the warlords were still there. Mladic was still the Bosnian Serb general, was still in charge of the army. Karadzic was still in charge of the political structure. Nationalists on the Croatian side were still there. But we came in, we planned carefully, we showed we met business. We were able, therefore, quickly to reduce the size of our force. We have about 15,000, we, NATO, not just the U.S., we're about 5,000, about 15,000 troops there today. There's no war. It's unlikely that war will resume. And there is some progress, not nearly as much, towards these human rights goals, refugees returning. There is freedom of movement. And as the European Union expands, actually, the Bosnia problem is likely to be solved. In Kosovo, we had Milosevic launching the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo, 1.5 million refugees, a NATO intervention, and now Kosovo is under UN administration. Again, the forces that are there are being drawn down. In both cases, both during the war and during the occupation, there's not been a single Allied casualty due to hostile action. In these interventions, we promoted human rights, to be sure, saved lives, right of people to return home, but did we serve U.S. interests in going into the Balkans? Well, it's always hard to say what didn't happen. But the fact is that Bosnia could have been a Middle East, that is an Arab-Palestinian dispute, something that lasted for 50 years of endless conflict, something that was a breeding ground for terrorism, something that occupied the attention of European leaders and American leaders who should have been focused on other things. That's over. That didn't happen. Bosnia is not by no means in perfect shape. In fact, it's more or less in passable shape, but it is not a source of conflict in Europe. And the cost was low. Obviously, this contrasts greatly with the situation in Iraq today. And let me just conclude by posing a question. Could Iraq have been done differently? And would it have turned out better had it been justified not on the basis of weapons of mass destruction, which we didn't know that they weren't there, but we did know they were not a threat on the day the war began. There was no way that Iraq did not have nuclear weapons on the day the war began, and if it had weapons of mass destruction on the day the war began, it could not use them. But could we have justified, so that the WMD justification was in fact weak. But was there a human rights justification, a humanitarian justification against a regime that indisputably committed genocide against the Kurds? And I haven't talked about it, but there's another case against the Marsh Arabs, about 500,000 people, an ancient civilization that was wiped out in the 1990s. Well, the evidence of this genocide is overwhelming. In one town, Al Hilal, we found 30,000 mass graves. It was one town alone. And could we have made the case? Well, part of it, and these will be issues we'll discuss in the panel, for example, war crimes trials. Not just run by Iraqis, but by the United Nations. Not because they're more efficient, but because everybody will accept their legitimacy. And would that strengthen our case? Well, I think actually we would be in a much stronger position, although it would have required something else that didn't take place, which is planning. I was in Baghdad 4 days after the Americans arrived, got there on the 13th. And I arrived into a city that was largely undamaged because the bombing was very precise. But we had no plan to secure anything. And thus it was in the ensuing month or more, every significant public institution in the city was systematically looted and burned on our watch. And don't blame the Iraqis. I can tell you, living much of my life in Washington, D.C., that if all of a sudden the president, the Congress, the Army, and all the police disappeared from Washington, D.C., I would not expect to find that many paintings in the National Gallery. But if you're coming in to occupy, and that's what we did, legally we were occupiers, you have an obligation, a legal obligation to protect, and that we didn't do. Couldn't protect everything, but we didn't plan to protect anything. And I would argue to you that the downward slope that we have been on is a result of that failure of planning, that failure to secure things, because we did not and do not look to Iraqis like we're a superpower. We look like either we intended this or we're incompetent. And then we had enormous confusion. One day we were hiring the old Baathists to their jobs. The next day we fired them. One day we were going to be turning power over to a provisional government. The next day Iraqi participation was just advisory. So a different rationale for the war, but also it would have required planning. We can't let this done. But I guess what I would conclude by saying is that we are inheriting not only the legacy of a lack of planning, but in the broader sense, the legacy of realpolitik supposedly trumping human rights. And I think, at least I hope I've persuaded you that perhaps a different course of action, going back to the 80s and the 90s, might leave us not talking about Iraq at this conference today.
We have time for some question and answer. I realize that some of you are going to need to get into class, so do that quietly if possible. And in the meantime, let's take a few questions and so forth. Sure, go ahead in the back.
I didn't quite understand what you were getting at when you said that change of objective in Iraq. You say that would change the outcome of what happened and if we went in under human rights, freedom rather than the WMD.
Okay.
Elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, and just a footnote here. Actually, let's let some people escape for a moment. And the other footnote is that we are trying to tape this and do this on a broadcast or a webcast or something, and we aren't going to get it if we don't have the mic. So if we could ask speakers, questioners to wait a moment for a mic. Did you catch that question?
I did, and
okay.
I'll restate it.
Okay, go ahead and restate it, and let's do that while people continue to mix and mingle here, if that's okay.
The question is am I arguing that if there had been a different objective in the war, a human rights objective rather than a WMD objective, would the results have been different? Well, first, what I would say is that what I was really talking about was not objectives, but justifications. And I do think that a justification based on the conduct of the Iraqi regime, the nature of the Iraqi regime, the genocide it committed, would have been more persuasive to the international community than a WMD justification when WMD was clearly not a threat on the day the war began and when no WMD, in fact, has been found. Would it be sufficient? And I think, to be honest, that there's a real argument about it, so I don't want to push this too far. The difference between Iraq in 2003 and Bosnia and Kosovo is that in Bosnia and Kosovo, at the time of the intervention, the human rights violations were ongoing. In 2003 in Iraq, although Saddam Hussein's record is much bloodier than Milosevic's, you didn't have the same ongoing activity like the genocide against the Kurds in the late 1980s. I mean, yes, people were still being killed every day, but it wasn't the massive kind of killings that led to the interventions in Bosnia and Kosovo. Fundamentally, though, I think that the real difference was lack of planning, and we've simply got ourselves on an incomprehensible lack of planning. We've got ourselves on a slope from which I don't actually think we can recover. Let me take one other in the back, and then I'll come up to the front.
Hi. My question is regarding the idea of prosecuting war criminals. I know I read an article recently in the Wall Street Journal that talked about how when Charles Taylor, when the prosecutors served up the papers or whatnot, he was criticized, the prosecutor was, for doing so. I guess there's a split on how people feel about this issue, or whether or not you should forgive the dead and let things go, or whether you should prosecute these people and that somehow bring that public memory issue up and let people deal with it. And I guess just maybe speak a little bit to that in terms of what's best for the people that have been oppressed and things like that.
Okay. The question is it better to prosecute people who commit war crimes, or is it better to have some kind of amnesty and to get on, not to go over these wounds and try to get reconciliation? And the question was asked in the particular context of the prosecutor announcing the indictment of Charles Taylor, the Liberian leader. There are two separate issues here. One was the timing of the indictment of Taylor, and here I'm not actually a full expert on what happened in Liberia, but the timing of the indictment just as the United Nations was trying to negotiate Taylor's exit. And, of course, being indicted at that point in time would be a reason for him not to leave, for fear that if he left, he would then be subject to prosecution. And this is a dilemma, because you get really nasty characters. If you can get them out without a war, and the price of that is impunity, is that a price worth paying? Well, maybe it is. I mean, as awful as their record is, a war is even more costly. Or in some cases, because there really wasn't a will to intervene in Liberia, maybe you can't get them out at all. The same issue arose, interestingly, when the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia indicted Milosevic during the Kosovo bombing. And many thought, in the Clinton administration, thought this was a disaster. It turned out to be actually a very good thing, because Milosevic then realized he had no exit. And if he allowed the war to continue, then the Americans would not only go into Kosovo, but they would have to come for him in Belgrade, and he would end up in the Hague Tribunal. And so instead he cut a deal and ended up in the Hague Tribunal anyhow. Tough luck. Now, the separate issue, justice versus forgiveness. And sometimes this is posed between justice versus truth commissions. Although you can have both, and I know Professor Shriver will talk some about this. My view, and I feel very strongly about this, is that you have to have a process of justice. You may also have truth commissions, but and that this is not just a nice thing to do. This is realpolitik. This is essential to the peace. In the former Yugoslavia, the war that took place in 91 to 95 was followed by 50 years another war that took place in 41 to 45. Hitler invaded the old Yugoslavia. The Croatians split off. There were many who sided with the Nazis. The others opposed the Nazis and were the communists. Very nasty. Hundreds of thousands dead. Tito came in. And he killed a whole bunch of the fascists, and then the book was closed. The results were, and I saw this in 91 to 95, that people tended people felt there was unfinished business. Serbs would say, but we can't live in Croatia. They committed genocide. They, the Croats, committed genocide against us between 1941 and 45. Well, it wasn't the Croats, and wasn't very many living Croats. It was Ante Pavlović. It was specific individuals. But they were never held to account in a trial, in something that people saw was fair, where the record was exposed. And thus, instead of blaming individuals, the blame went to groups. And thus the conflict continued another two generations later. So it seems to me it's absolutely indispensable to this process that you hold the individuals who are responsible for these crimes accountable. Then there's the issue of the forum where you do it. Should it be a domestic forum? Should it be an international forum? Well, if you do it domestically in Croatia, in Serbia, it may not, in Iraq, it may not be accepted by the people who were supporting the ousted leaders. What is clear, and I testified in the Milosevic trial against him, so I saw that up close. It's a rather inefficient process, although it's also a very complicated kind of case. I mean, but what is clear is that nobody could argue that it was not a fair and impartial tribunal. And it was very educational for Serbs to see this. It's televised or available in Serbia. The same thing for the Croats who've been tried, and so on. What are we going to do with the top Iraqi leaders? So we have a huge number of them. If they're tried in an American military tribunal, will people in the Arab world see this as legitimate? I don't think so. Will European left-wing critics of the United States see this as credible? No, I don't think so. Will Iraqi supporters of the old regime see this as credible? Certainly not. A UN tribunal? Yeah. I think that's going to have a lot more credibility. And the case against these guys is overwhelming. I mean, this is not a close call. Now, one of the objections to an international tribunal is that it's inefficient, it's slow. The Milosevic case is the prosecution's taking 2 years to present its case, and Milosevic will get 2 years for the defense. But hey, this guy is charged with genocide in Bosnia and Kosovo, war crimes in Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo. This is kind of complicated to prove. First, you have to prove that all these people were killed. You have to show that the Serbian forces were responsible. Mass killing doesn't equal genocide. You have to show it's genocide. You have to show there was the intent to do this. You then have to show that you could get Milosevic on one of two theories, either that he was in command or that he personally ordered it. You have to show that he's in command. You have to get Confederates to testify that he gave orders. And it's hard to do. It's one thing to prosecute if you're doing it in your own country, but remember, they're trying to prosecute getting other governments to cooperate, the Serbian government, the Croatian government, the Bosnian government. Very complicated, and consider that, before we get high and mighty as Americans, hey, it took the state of California a full year to prosecute O.J. Simpson unsuccessfully for a garden variety double murder. I mean, and this here we're talking about 230,000 dead. So it is complicated, but in my view, it's worth doing. Let's go here.
I have a question about...
Hold up.
Got this working now? Good.
Okay. I have a question about what you talked about, the dichotomy in the Middle East between human rights, pursuing human rights, and U.S. interests. The United States supports Saudi Arabia and Egypt with, for example, a lot of money in what many say supports regimes that violate human rights, and there isn't much sovereignty. The present administration and other people have argued that the reason for that is to ensure that there isn't a rise of Islamic fundamentalism, etc., and to keep security in the region. Do you think, then, that what you've talked about supporting human rights instead of going for realpolitik would help in these cases? And do you think if Islamic fundamentalism were to rise, say, for example, Mubarak were to fall, and Islamic fundamentalists took over, would that be first a bad thing for human rights, and second of all a bad thing for U.S. interests in the region?
Well, the thrust of my argument is that this is a false dichotomy, and that pursuing human rights quite often is realpolitik. That is, and I use the Iraq case, had we had a human rights-oriented policy toward Iraq, we would have had a much better result than the so-called realpolitik policy of building a strategic alliance with a Saddam Hussein, which is what happened in the Reagan administration. And because inherently a regime like Saddam Hussein, a regime that attacks one neighbor, Iran, that uses chemical weapons, that engages in genocide, can never be reliable. That's my basic argument. When you come to Saudi Arabia and to Egypt, though, you raise there are problems, which is that we are victims of our past policy. We have been allied with these regimes. Therefore, the resentment that rises is not only against the regimes, it's against us. And there isn't a, or there's not a moderate democratic alternative. But you have, in fact, in Saudi Arabia, the Osama bin Ladens, and in Egypt you have the Islamic Brotherhood, and that is a dilemma that you have. I mean, once you get on this horse of supporting repressive regimes, it's not so easy to dismount. That's what Carter found when eventually cut off the Shah of Iran, and so I don't have a clear answer to it. But I suppose the answer is at least to be embarked on to have human rights as an ever larger component, in the hopes that you can encourage and support moderate democratic alternatives. The other point I make is
think that human the right thing is realpolitik, and that we get into trouble by having this false dichotomy. Maybe not in every case. I mean, I have some sympathy to not hammering too much on Chechnya, because there are a lot of bennies that we're getting from our relations with Putin. What we're doing in Musharraf is a complex problem, although I think there's going to be a terrible price to pay in Pakistan, which is a near-failed state.
We're talking about how the justification for the war could have been human rights. If that had been, would the U.S. have a greater for other human rights in the world? Or how would we draw the line? How do we draw the line saying this is where we will intervene, this is where we won't intervene in human rights violations?
This is a great question, and it comes up in every one of these cases. During the Kosovo crisis, I was constantly on television with, particularly on Fox, with Ollie North and Hannity and Combs and all these shows that my wife doesn't let me watch. And they'd be saying, but you're supporting this in Kosovo, but what about what Turkey's doing to the Kurds, or China to the Tibetans, or the U.S. didn't intervene in Rwanda? And the answer to that is, it's very simple. If you can't fix every problem, does that mean you don't intervene in any case? I mean, this is a very imperfect world, and if we are capable of preventing a genocide in one place, of improving lives at an acceptable cost, is this something that we should do? I think it should be decided on its own merits, of basically weighing the cost to us, the benefits, and not on an argument about how we're being selective. Inevitably, we're going to be selective. I don't think any sensible person would advocate military intervention against nuclear-armed China, regardless of what they do to the Tibetans, as sympathetic as I think most of us are to the Tibetans and the Dalai Lama, or for that matter, whatever the Russians do in Chechnya. The cost is simply too high. So I don't think that this is a valid argument. I mean, it's a rhetorical argument, but in the real world, you do have to choose. Let's see.
One of the major human rights concerns is the refugee population in the world. I'm wondering how a state can effectively pursue taking care of the human rights and the refugee issues while balancing security issues as well. For example, refugee camps serving as terrorist havens, things like that.
Well, of course, the best policy for refugees is to try to avoid the conditions that create refugees. And to some degree, these humanitarian interventions, that's one of their major goals. This was a driving force, particularly for the Europeans in Bosnia and Kosovo, because they were overwhelmed by people from the former Yugoslavia. Second, in some of these cases, like Afghan refugees, you have people who are refugees for 20, 30 years. You've got to provide opportunities for them where they are. You can't allow the refugee camps to become breeding grounds for terrorism. You have to recognize that in some cases, it suits the governments of the region to keep people in refugee camps as a political tool, and to some degree to encourage the breeding ground for terrorists. This is clearly true of the Palestinians, who have been kept by host governments in camps for 55 years. But I guess the answer is that refugees represent they're a humanitarian problem, but they are a realpolitik problem. It isn't just in the short term. It's people who look emaciated and who are subject to abuse. In the long term, it is a national security problem, which we have for us and for the Europeans, in fact, for the developed world, and we simply have to address it. Yeah. Okay. Let me take one more question over here.
I just want to know where this is going to be posted online. You said all this is going to be posted. So it's a simple one. You can take another
Well,
one.
there'll be an answer to that afterwards, since I certainly don't know. But we'll take another question. Well, why don't we go to the gentleman next to you?
We've been talking a lot about United States intervention in wars and human rights violations. I would like to know what you think about the UN and their responsibility to support interventions in human rights, and if you think they've been successful in their interventions in the world.
2 minutes or less, please.
The United Nations is not some autonomous entity. It is simply a collection of the world's countries, and it's governed by the Security Council, of which the United States is the most important member, and the United States and its allies, NATO allies, France and Britain, are key members, and Russia, which is something of an ally. So anytime we cite a shortcoming of the United Nations, it's really a shortcoming of the United States and of American diplomacy. It's not an independent world government, and it's a very important. It's what I like to say: if you don't like the concert, don't blame the concert hall. Blame the musicians. But there are some very important issues on intervention, and I'll address two of them in the 2 minutes I have. The first is the issue of legitimacy. Who gets to decide where you intervene? And is it the right of the United States? Well, that isn't accepted by other countries. And, of course, the doctrine of non-intervention is embodied in international law. It's embodied in the UN Charter. Small countries are very concerned about this adherence to this principle. Interestingly, though, the norms are changing, and there is an acceptance that sovereignty is diminished, and there are certain things that you can intervene on. Clearly, genocide. And the African countries accept that there should have been intervention in the case of Rwanda. They accept intervention in the case of Liberia and Sierra Leone. They call for it. They blame the United States for not interfering in their internal affairs, whereas 15 years ago they would have blamed the United States for intervening. So there is, and this is, I think, the most positive development of my lifetime in international affairs, is this diminution of sovereignty, of a shared community. The UN Security Council is the vehicle to provide the legitimacy. But what happens if the Security Council can't act? It was true in Kosovo. There was an overwhelming majority for intervention, but the Russians, who were allies of the Serbs, would veto it. Can you justify an intervention in those circumstances? I think it's tough, but I think it could be justified on a doctrine of emergency, where there is an ongoing human rights violation, literally millions of people, more than 1 million people being expelled by their homes. You move, and then you get the support later, just like if you're a policeman and you see a crime in progress. And it worked in that case because the Russians did go along with a UN mission justifying it. So legitimacy is one set of issues. The other is implementation. Well, look at Iraq. What a great job we're doing. What good planning we've done. It turns out that the United Nations does it better. They actually have a lot of experience in this sort of thing, nation building. They know how to organize. They know what's involved. And, in the arrogance that characterized the post-war planning, this was totally dismissed. And we, as a country, are paying a huge price. We, as taxpayers, are paying a huge price. So our military is paying a huge price being targets. The UN, one of the things they do extremely well is they organize elections in these countries. And in post-conflict situations, nobody ever questions the results, which is more that can be said even about elections run in this country. People accept it. They know how to count the votes. So that's a clear role for them. They know how to develop interim justice systems that have a great deal of legitimacy. They know a lot about training police. So I think that we need to get off our high horse and accept. There are, of course, many things that we do well. We have a military that's second to none. But there are other things that we don't do well, and we do well to work with the United Nations, and that also means with our partners. But that comes with a price, which means that we have to listen to what they have to say. They aren't just going to do when we say jump. They aren't going to say how high. They're going to want to know, should we jump here, and let's go together. But it turns out, and I think Iraq's going to be very instructive about how we really can't do these things alone.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.